The bid caller whispered she was forsaken by God himself, but when Marcus Blackstone saw those chains around her wrists, he saw only a woman who'd been forsaken by men who'd forgotten what mercy looked like. Black Hills Territory, Dakota. September 1871. The autumn wind cut through Deadwood Gulch like a knife through prayer, carrying with it the scent of pine, wood smoke, and the kind of desperation that clung to boom towns like dust on a miner's boots. The settlement had sprouted from nothing in just 2 years. A collection of rough-hewn buildings and canvas tents stretched along Whitewood Creek, where men came to scratch gold from the earth and often found only broken dreams buried in the black soil. At the center of town, where the main trail split toward the mining camps and the trading posts, stood Kowalski's Mercantile and Auction House, a 2-story wooden structure that served as courthouse, saloon, and place of final judgment for anything or anyone deemed unfit for civilized society. Tonight, the building blazed with lamplight, casting long shadows across the muddy street where horses stamped and snorted in the crisp evening air. Inside the crowded main room, beneath hanging oil lamps that flickered like dying stars, Judge Cornelius Ashford stood behind a makeshift podium fashioned from stacked whiskey crates. His black coat was immaculate despite the frontier setting, his silver beard trimmed to perfection, his pale eyes holding the cold certainty of a man who believed divine will flowed through his gavel. In his weathered hands, he clutched a leather-bound Bible so worn the gold lettering had long since faded to ghost impressions. The pages fell open naturally to Leviticus, marked by years of finger-stained searching for verses that justified the harshest interpretations of frontier justice. Behind him, painted on a piece of canvas that served as a backdrop, hung a crude rendering of the scales of justice, though the paint had begun to peel in the humidity, making the blindfolded woman appear to weep tears of white lead. Gentlemen of Deadwood. His voice rang through the smoky air, sharp enough to cut through the murmur of 40-odd men packed shoulder to shoulder. Tonight we cleanse our community of the moral pestilence that has festered among us like gangrene in an untended wound. He raised the Bible high, its pages fluttering in the draft from the open door. Tonight we cast out the woman who has brought nothing but ruin and damnation to every soul foolish enough to show her Christian charity. The lamplight caught the silver cross hanging from his watch chain, casting a twisted shadow across the podium that looked more like a dagger than a symbol of salvation. A low rumble of agreement rippled through the crowd, miners and merchants, alike nodding their approval. These were hard men carved from harder times, their faces weathered by wind and want, their hands scarred by pick handles and rope burns. They'd come to the Black Hills seeking fortune and found mostly heartbreak. And like all disappointed men, they needed someone to blame for their misfortunes. The air was thick with tobacco smoke and the sour smell of unwashed bodies packed too close together, while outside the autumn wind rattled the windows like skeleton fingers against glass. From the back corner of the room, near the pot-bellied stove that glowed red with coal heat, an old Lakota woman rose slowly to her feet. Her hair was silver white, braided with small bones and feathers, her face mapped with lines that spoke of 8 decades of watching white men's justice unfold in her people's sacred hills. She wore a mixture of traditional buckskin and traded calico, her moccasins making no sound on the rough plank floor as she stepped forward. Around her neck hung a medicine bag that her grandmother had sewn from the hide of a white buffalo, and her eyes held the deep knowing of someone who had seen this story played out 100 times before. She is no curse, the old woman's voice cut through the murmur like a blade, each word pronounced with the careful precision of someone speaking in her third language. She is a daughter of the earth, marked by grief, not by evil. You white men see darkness where there is only sorrow. Her gnarled hand pointed toward the judge with shocking steadiness. The only forsaken souls in this room are those who would sell a broken woman like cattle to ease their own guilty consciences. Judge Ashford's face flushed purple with rage, his knuckles white where they gripped the Bible. Silence that heathen. He roared, spittle flying from his lips. Two burly miners, their arms thick as tree trunks from years of swinging pickaxes, moved to grab the old woman's arms. But she did not resist or cry out. Instead, she allowed them to force her back to her place by the stove, her eyes never leaving. Ashford's face, her expression holding a mixture of pity and disgust that made the judge's hand tremble where it held his gavel. The crowd quieted again, but an uneasy tension had settled over the room like smoke from a damp fire. The old woman's words had found their mark, and several of the younger men shifted uncomfortably, their eyes dropping to study the worn floorboards beneath their boots. Even in a place where might made right and gold spoke louder than conscience, there were still a few souls who remembered what their mothers had taught them about treating women with respect. Then came the creak of the side door that led from the back stairs, the sound of chains dragging across wood, and the heavy footsteps of men who carried the weight of unpleasant duty. The crowd turned as one, 40-odd faces swiveling toward the source of the sound like sunflowers following the arc of the sun. Through the doorway stepped two territorial marshals, their badges dull silver in the lamplight, their expressions grim as pallbearers. Between them, connected to each man by a length of iron chain, walked the woman who had become the subject of Deadwood's collective fear and fascination. Josephine Fairfax entered the room like a ghost made flesh, her bare feet making no sound on the rough planks despite the heavy shackles that bound her ankles. She wore a simple gray dress that had once been white, its fabric torn and stained from weeks of confinement in the territorial jail. Her long auburn hair hung loose around her shoulders, unwashed and tangled with bits of straw from the cell where she'd been kept like an animal awaiting slaughter. But it was her face that caught the breath in every man's throat and held it there until their lungs burned with the effort of remembering how to breathe. She was beautiful in the way that broken things could be beautiful, like a statue carved from pale marble and then shattered by some terrible force before being carefully pieced back together. Her skin was the color of fresh cream, though marred by bruises that told the story of rough handling and rougher justice. Her eyes were the deep green of pine needles, but hollow in a way that spoke of losses too profound for tears. She didn't weep or plead or show any of the emotions that men expected from women in desperate circumstances. Instead, she stood straight-backed. In the center of the room, her chin raised with a pride that neither chains nor cruelty had been able to break. Judge Ashford gestured toward her with his gavel as if unveiling some unholy relic, his voice dropping to a whisper that somehow carried to every corner of the room. "Behold, gentlemen, the widow Fairfax, she who has buried 3 husbands in as many years." His pale eyes glittered with something that might have been fear or might have been excitement. They called her cursed in the settlements back east, marked by the devil himself to bring death to any man foolish enough to love her. Some say she poisoned them with herbs gathered under the dark moon. Others claim she called down fever and consumption with words learned from Indian medicine women. But all agree on one thing. His voice rose again, filling the room with its terrible certainty. Every man who has shared her bed has found his grave within the year. A collective gasp rippled through the crowd, followed by the sound of men crossing themselves and muttering prayers under their breath. Several miners near the front took an unconscious step backward, as if her very presence might somehow contaminate them with whatever dark curse she carried. The air in the room seemed to grow thicker, heavy with superstition and the kind of fear that men felt when confronted with forces beyond their understanding. But Josephine's expression never changed. She stood motionless in her chains, her green eyes scanning the faces around her with the detached interest of someone cataloging specimens in a museum. She seemed to be looking for something or someone, though what that might be remained as mysterious as everything else about her. When her gaze passed over the old Lakota woman by the stove, the faintest ghost of a smile touched her lips, gone so quickly that most of the men missed it entirely. "The first husband," Ashford continued, his voice taking on the rhythm of a preacher delivering a sermon on damnation, was Thomas Fairfax, a good Christian man who took pity on an orphan girl and offered her the protection of his name. Found dead in his own wheat field 3 months after the wedding, his body twisted. In agony, his face black as coal. The doctor in Yankton said it was his heart, but the coroner found no natural cause for such suffering. Josephine's jaw tightened almost imperceptibly, the only sign that the judge's words had found their mark. Her fingers, elegant despite the dirt beneath her nails, clenched into fists where they hung at her sides. For just a moment, something flashed in her green eyes that might have been pain or might have been fury, but it was gone before anyone could be certain they'd seen it. The second, Ashford pressed on, his voice growing more theatrical with each word, was Jonathan Miller, a widower with 2 young children, who thought himself wise enough to tame whatever wildness lived in her soul. He lasted 6 months before the consumption took him, coughing up blood in his own parlor while she sat beside his bed, reading from books written in languages no Christian woman should know. His children were sent east to relatives who wanted nothing to do with the woman who had brought death into their father's house. The crowd leaned forward, hungry for details of the tragedies that had followed this woman like storm clouds. Several men made the sign of the cross, while others touched the lucky charms they wore around their necks, talismans against the kind of evil they believed walked among them in human form. The temperature in the room seemed to drop several degrees, the weather from the autumn wind outside or some other cause. None could say. And the third. Ashford's voice had risen to a near shout, his face flushed with righteous indignation. Was Captain Henry Dalton of the Territorial Cavalry, a war hero who survived Gettysburg and Antietam only to fall to whatever poison flows in this woman's veins. Thrown from his horse during what should have been a routine patrol, his neck broken on the very rocks where she had been seen gathering roots and mushrooms the night before. 3 men, gentlemen. 3 good Christian souls, all dead within a year of saying "I do" to the woman who stands before you tonight. The silence that followed was broken only by the hiss of coal in the stove, and the distant howl of wind through the gaps in the walls. Josephine stood unmoved by the recitation of her supposed crimes, her green eyes now fixed on some point beyond the crowd, as if she were looking through the walls and across the miles to some distant place where justice might wear a different face. When she finally spoke, her voice was soft but clear, carrying the faint trace of an accent that might have been Irish or might have been something else entirely. They died because death comes to all men, Your Honor. The only difference is that some find it sooner than others. Her words fell into the silence like stones into still water, sending ripples of unease through the assembled crowd. I did not kill my husbands any more than I killed the winters that took the cattle, or the floods that washed away the crops. I am guilty of nothing more than having the misfortune to love men who were destined for early graves. Judge Ashford's face twisted with rage at her calm response to his accusations. He slammed his gavel down on the makeshift podium with such force that the whiskey crates beneath it groaned in protest. Blasphemy! He roared, pointing an accusing finger at her as if she were the devil himself. You speak with the tongue of a serpent, woman, seeking to corrupt these good men with your lies and witchcraft. But we have not gathered here tonight to listen to your excuses or your explanations. We are here to rid ourselves of the curse you represent before it can claim any more innocent lives. The crowd stirred restlessly, some nodding in agreement with the judge's words while others seemed less certain. The younger men, in particular, found their eyes drawn to Josephine's face despite the warnings they'd heard about her supposed powers. There was something in her bearing, in the way she refused to bow her head or beg for mercy, that spoke to a strength of character that seemed at odds with the picture of evil that had been painted for them. Let the auction begin, Ashford declared, his voice cutting through their uncertainty like a blade. She must be claimed by some man willing to take responsibility for her actions, or she will be taken to the territorial capital and hanged for the practice of witchcraft. No soul shall leave this hall until her fate is decided, one way or another." He raised his gavel again, its wooden head catching the lamplight like a weapon. "What am I bid for the widow Fairfax and whatever curse she carries with her?" The auction began with the heavy silence of men too afraid to speak, too superstitious to risk whatever doom might follow from taking such a woman into their homes. The only sounds were the crackle of the fire in the stove, the scratch of mice in the walls, and the steady drip of water from a leak in the roof that no one had bothered to repair. Outside, the wind picked up, rattling the windows and sending a cold draft through the room that made the lamp flames dance and flicker. Finally, a voice from the back of the room broke the silence, harsh with mockery and whiskey courage. $10, shouted Jake Morrison, a grizzled miner whose luck had run out months ago, leaving him bitter and mean. "Though that's probably too much for a woman who'll have me in the ground by Christmas." His words drew nervous laughter from some of the crowd, the kind of laughter that men use to mask their fear when confronted with things they didn't understand. $5, called another voice, this one belonging to a young farmer named Pete Kowalski, nephew to the man who owned the building they stood in. "And that's generous for a woman who comes with a guarantee of widowhood." More laughter followed, but it had an edge to it now, the sharp sound of men trying to turn tragedy into comedy, because it was easier than facing the possibility that they might be making a terrible mistake. Judge Ashford raised his hand for silence, his pale eyes scanning the crowd for higher bids. "Come now, gentlemen," he said with false heartiness. "Surely someone among you has the Christian charity to offer more than pocket change for a woman's life, cursed though she may be. Remember, this is not just an auction but an act of mercy, taking responsibility for a soul that might otherwise face the gallows." But the silence stretched on, broken only by nervous coughs and the shuffle of boots on wooden floors. No man wanted to risk whatever fate might follow from taking Josephine Fairfax into his home, no matter how beautiful she might be, or how pitifully she stood there in her chains. They had heard the stories, seen the fear in the eyes of those who had known her husbands, and none were willing to gamble their lives on the possibility that the tales of her curse might be exaggerated. Then the door at the back of the room creaked open, letting in a gust of cold air that made every flame in the building flicker and dance. Through the doorway stepped a figure that few in Deadwood knew well, a man who lived on the edges of their world and rarely came to town except when winter supplies ran low or pelts needed selling. Marcus Blackstone stood just inside the doorway, snow dusting his broad shoulders, a rifle slung across his back, his dark eyes taking in the scene before him with the careful assessment of a man who had learned to read danger in the smallest details. He was tall and lean in the way of men who lived hard lives in hard country, his hair black as a raven's wing and hanging loose to his shoulders in the manner of someone who spent more time with wolves than with barbers. His skin was weathered brown by wind and sun, marked with small scars that told the story of 1,000 encounters with thorns, claws, and the sharp edges of survival. He wore buckskin and wool, clothes that had been chosen for warmth and durability rather than fashion, and his boots were the high-topped kind favored by men who walked through snow that came up to their knees. But it was his eyes that drew attention, dark as winter storms, and holding depths that spoke of solitude and secrets. They were the eyes of a man who had seen things that most people only encountered in nightmares, who had learned to find beauty in places where others saw only wilderness and want. Those eyes moved across the crowd with quiet intensity, taking in the faces of the miners and merchants, the territorial marshals with their bored expressions, the old Lakota woman by the stove who watched him with something that might have been recognition. And then his gaze found Josephine, and everything else in the room seemed to fade into insignificance. She stood there in her chains and torn dress, her auburn hair catching the lamplight like burnished copper, her green eyes meeting his across the smoky distance, with a directness that made his breath catch in his throat. There was no fear in her expression, no plea for rescue or pity. Instead, there was something else. Something that he recognized because he had seen it in his own mirror during the long years of solitude that had followed his own losses. It was the look of someone who had been broken by life but had refused to let that breaking destroy the essential core of who they were. It was the expression of a person who had learned to expect nothing from the world and therefore could not be disappointed when the world offered nothing in return. It was the face of someone who had made peace with the possibility of dying alone and unloved, but who still carried within them a spark of hope that maybe, just maybe, things could be different. Marcus had come to Deadwood for supplies, nothing more. Winter was coming to the Black Hills, and his cabin in the high country would soon be cut off from civilization by snow that wouldn't melt until spring. He needed coffee and ammunition, salt pork and blankets, the things that would see him through the months of isolation that lay ahead. He had planned to make his purchases quickly and quietly, to avoid the kind of attention that his mixed heritage often attracted in places where men's prejudices ran as deep as their fears. His mother had been Lakota, daughter of a medicine man who had taught her the old ways before the reservation system had tried to steal them away. His father had been a Scottish fur trader who had loved her enough to learn her language and live by her people's customs until the cavalry had come and made such love a crime punishable by exile or death. Marcus had inherited the best and worst of both worlds: his mother's understanding of the land and its spirits, his father's skill with weapons and trade goods, and a heritage that made him welcome nowhere and suspect everywhere. But something in Josephine's expression called to him across the crowded room, something that spoke to the part of his soul that had learned to recognize kindred spirits in the most unlikely places. She was not the demon that Judge Ashford had described, not the witch that the crowd seemed to believe her to be. She was simply a woman who had loved unwisely and lost completely, who had been blamed for tragedies that were no more her fault than avalanches were the fault of the mountains where they occurred. The silence in the room had grown heavy as lead, pressing down on the assembled men like the weight of their own consciences. Judge Ashford looked ready to declare the auction a failure, to order Josephine loaded into a wagon bound for the territorial capital and whatever justice waited there. The marshals shifted restlessly, eager to be done with their unpleasant duty, and returned to pursuits that didn't involve the transport of women who might or might not be cursed. And then Marcus stepped forward, his boot heels ringing against the wooden floor like gunshots in the silence. Every eye in the room turned to follow his progress as he made his way through the crowd, men stepping aside to let him pass with the unconscious deference that dangerous things commanded. He moved with the fluid grace of someone who had spent years learning to walk silently through forests where a careless step might mean the difference between eating and starving, between living and dying. When he reached the front of the room, he stopped just a few feet from where Josephine stood, in her chains. For a long moment, they simply looked at each other, two people who understood what it meant to be alone in a world that had no place for them. Her green eyes searched his face, looking for something that she might have given up hope of ever finding. His dark gaze took in every detail of her appearance, from the bruises on her wrists where the shackles had rubbed raw to the proud set of her shoulders, despite everything she had endured. "I did my winter's work," Marcus said finally, his voice carrying clearly through the stunned silence. He reached into his coat and withdrew a leather pouch that clinked softly with the sound of gold coins, the proceeds from a season of trapping in country where lesser men would have frozen or starved. $200 in gold dust and nuggets, panned from streams where no white man has ever set foot. He placed the pouch on Judge Ashford's makeshift podium, the weight of it making the whiskey crates creak in protest. The room erupted in gasps and muttered conversations as men who had never seen so much money in one place tried to comprehend what they were witnessing. $200 was more than most of them made in a year, enough to buy a good horse and saddle, enough to stake a mining claim and work it through an entire season. It was wealth beyond the dreams of men who counted their fortunes in pounds. A flower and ounces of tobacco. Judge Ashford stared at the leather pouch as if it might contain snakes instead of gold, his pale eyes wide with something that might have been avarice or might have been fear. "That is," he stammered, his usual eloquence deserting him in the face of such unexpected generosity, "that is a considerable sum, Mr. Blackstone. But surely you understand the risks involved in taking such a woman into your household. The stories of her curse are well documented, the deaths of her husbands a matter of public record." Marcus turned his dark gaze on the judge, and something in his expression made the older man take an involuntary step backward. "I've heard the stories, Your Honor," he said quietly, his voice carrying the kind of calm certainty that came from years of facing down bears and blizzards and other forces that could kill a man without hesitation. "I've also learned not to put much faith in stories told by men who profit from other people's fear." His eyes swept the crowd, taking in the faces of miners and merchants who suddenly found their boots very interesting to look at. Perhaps the real curse in this room is the willingness of supposedly civilized men to sell a woman's life to ease their own guilty consciences. The words hit the assembled crowd like a physical blow, sending murmurs of anger and shame rippling through the room. Several men started forward, their faces flushed with indignation, but something in Marcus's bearing made them think better of their impulses. He stood perfectly still, perfectly balanced, like a coiled spring waiting for an excuse to release its stored energy. The rifle across his back might as well have been part of his body for all the attention he paid it, but everyone in the room understood that he could have it in his hands, and firing before most of them could draw breath to shout. "Furthermore," Marcus continued, his voice never rising above a conversational tone, despite the tension crackling through the air, "I question the authority of this court to auction human beings like livestock. Last I checked, President Lincoln settled that particular issue some years back, and the 13th Amendment made it the law of the land." He gestured toward Josephine with a slight nod of his head. "This woman may be many things, but she is not property to be bought and sold at the whim of men who call themselves Christians while behaving like something considerably less." Judge Ashford's face had gone from pale to purple, his hands shaking with rage as he clutched his Bible like a weapon. "How dare you question the authority of this court, you half-breed savage?" he snarled, spittle flying from his lips. "This woman is a danger to every God-fearing soul in this territory, and it is our Christian duty to see that she is properly contained before she can work her evil on any more innocent men." His voice had risen to a near shriek, his composure completely shattered by Marcus's calm defiance of everything he represented. The slur hung in the air like smoke from a gunshot, and the temperature in the room seemed to drop another 10 degrees. Marcus's expression never changed, but something shifted behind his dark eyes, something that made even the bravest men in the crowd take a step backward. When he spoke again, his voice was so quiet that everyone had to strain to hear him, but the words carried the weight of mountains and the patience of winter storms. "Judge Ashford," he said, each syllable precise as a blade edge, "I am going to pretend that you did not just use that particular word in my presence, because if I thought you meant it, I would be forced to demonstrate why my mother's people called me he who walks with thunder." His hand moved in a gesture so casual it almost seemed accidental, but suddenly the bone handle of a hunting knife was visible above his belt, and everyone in the room understood that death had just entered their conversation. "Now, are you going to accept my bid and transfer custody of Mrs. Fairfax to me, or do we need to discuss this matter further?" The silence that followed was so complete that the sound of a pin dropping would have echoed like thunder. Judge Ashford stood frozen behind his podium, his face white as bone, his eyes fixed on Marcus's hand where it rested near his knife. The two territorial marshals had their hands on their weapons, but they made no move to draw them, understanding with the instinct of professional lawmen that they were facing someone who could probably kill them both before they cleared leather. And then Josephine spoke, her voice cutting through the tension like sunlight through storm clouds. "Mr. Blackstone," she said quietly, her green eyes fixed on his face with an intensity that made the rest of the room fade into insignificance. "You do not know me. You have no reason to believe that I am anything other than what these men claim me to be. Why would you risk your life and your fortune on someone who might indeed be cursed?" Marcus turned to face her fully, and for a moment it was as if they were the only two people in the room.
Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you.
"Because, Mrs. Fairfax," he said softly, his voice carrying a warmth that had been absent when he spoke to the judge, "I have spent the last 10 years living alone in country that would kill most men in a week. I have faced down grizzlies and blizzards, hostile war parties, and claim jumpers, and I am still here to tell the tale." He paused, his dark eyes searching her face with an intensity that made her breath catch. "If you are truly cursed, then you will find yourself in good company, because I have been running from my own demons for longer than I care to remember. Perhaps it is time we both stopped running." The words hung in the air between them like a promise, like a challenge, like the first notes of a song that neither of them had heard before, but both somehow knew by heart. Josephine felt something stir in her chest that she had thought dead and buried with her third husband. Something that might have been hope or might have been the first flutter of wings that had been caged too long. Marcus saw the change in her expression, the subtle softening around her eyes that spoke of walls beginning to crumble. Judge Ashford cleared his throat loudly, the sound breaking the spell that had fallen over the room like a stone thrown through a window. "Very well," he said grudgingly, his voice hoarse with suppressed rage and something that might have been fear. "The bid of $200 in gold is accepted, and custody of the defendant is hereby transferred to Mr. Marcus Blackstone." He raised his gavel with hands that shook slightly. "May God have mercy on your soul, sir, because this woman surely will not." The gavel fell with a sound like a coffin lid closing, and suddenly the auction was over. The crowd began to disperse, men filing out into the night with backward glances and whispered conversations about what they had just witnessed. Some shook their heads in disapproval, convinced that they had just watched a good man sign his own death warrant. Others seemed almost relieved, glad to have the burden of Josephine's fate lifted from their collective conscience and placed on shoulders willing to bear it. The territorial marshals approached with keys to unlock her shackles, their movements cautious as if they expected her to sprout wings and claws the moment she was freed. The iron cuffs fell away from her wrists with a sound like chains breaking, revealing raw skin beneath that spoke of weeks of rough treatment. She rubbed her wrists gently, wincing at the pain but saying nothing, her eyes never leaving Marcus's face as he counted out gold coins and dust onto Judge Ashford's podium. When the transaction was complete, and the receipt signed in Ashford's cramped handwriting, Marcus turned back to Josephine with an expression that held no triumph, no satisfaction at having won some sort of contest. Instead, there was only a quiet determination, the look of a man who had made a decision and would see it through regardless of the consequences. "Mrs. Fairfax," he said formally, offering her his arm with the courtesy due a lady rather than a purchased woman, "if you are ready, I believe it is time we left this place." His voice carried no ownership, no sense that she now belonged to him by virtue of the gold he had paid. Instead, there was an invitation in his words, an offer rather than a command. Josephine looked at his extended arm for a long moment, her green eyes searching his face for some sign of the cruelty or greed that she had learned to expect from men who claimed to want to help her. But all she saw was patience, the quiet strength of someone who had learned to wait for what mattered and fight for what was right. Slowly, carefully, she placed her hand on his arm, feeling the solid warmth of muscle beneath the wool of his coat. Together, they walked toward the door that led out into the Dakota night, leaving behind the heat and smoke and judgment of Kowalski's auction house. Behind them, Judge Ashford clutched his Bible and his receipt, his face twisted with the bitter satisfaction of a man who believed he had just witnessed divine justice in action. The old Lakota woman by the stove watched them go with eyes that held ancient wisdom, and as they passed her chair, she whispered something in her native tongue that might have been a blessing or might have been a warning. Outside, the autumn wind had picked up, carrying with it the scent of snow and the promise of the long winter that lay ahead. Marcus's horse stood patiently at the hitching rail, a sturdy mountain pony that looked capable of carrying 2 people through whatever weather the high country might offer. As he helped Josephine into the saddle, his hands careful and respectful, she felt something that she had almost forgotten existed, something that had been crushed under the weight of 3 funerals and 100 whispered accusations. For the first time in longer than she could remember, Josephine Fairfax felt safe. The ride into the Black Hills began in silence, broken only by the steady rhythm of hoofbeats against frozen ground and the whisper of wind through pine needles that hung like green prayers in the darkness. Marcus guided his horse along trails that existed more in memory than reality, paths known only to trappers, traders, and the Lakota who still moved through these sacred mountains despite the government's attempts to confine them to reservations. Behind him, Josephine sat with the careful balance of someone unused to riding, her hands gripping the saddle horn with white knuckles, her body tense against the unfamiliar motion. The moon hung full and silver above the tree line, casting everything in shades of pewter and shadow, turning the familiar landscape into something from a fairy tale or a fever dream. Snow had begun to fall while they were inside the auction house, fat flakes that caught the moonlight like scattered diamonds before settling on the shoulders of Marcus's coat and the tangled auburn of Josephine's hair. The temperature was dropping fast, promising a hard freeze before dawn, and Marcus could smell the approach of a serious storm in the way the wind shifted and the clouds gathered overhead. They had been riding for nearly an hour when Josephine finally spoke, her voice barely audible above the creak of leather and the soft thud of the horse's hooves. "Mr. Blackstone," she said, her words forming small clouds in the frigid air, "I need to know what you expect from me." There was no coyness in her tone, no feminine artifice designed to entice or manipulate. Instead, there was the blunt directness of someone who had learned that survival often depended on understanding the terms of any arrangement before it was too late to escape. Marcus slowed the horse to a walk, giving himself time to consider his answer. The question was fair, more than fair given the circumstances of their meeting and the gold he had paid for the privilege of taking her away from Deadwood's version of justice. Most men who bid on women at auctions had specific expectations about what their money had purchased, and he could hardly blame her for assuming that he was no different from the others. "I expect nothing, Mrs. Fairfax," he said finally, his voice carrying easily through the thin mountain air. "What I mean is, I expect you to be exactly who you are, nothing more and nothing less. I did not buy you tonight, despite what that fool judge's paperwork might say. I bought your freedom, and what you choose to do with that freedom is entirely up to you." He paused, feeling the weight of her attention on his back like physical pressure. "If you want to leave come spring, I will give you supplies and directions to any settlement you choose. If you want to stay, you are welcome to do so. But the choice will always be yours to make." The words hung in the cold air between them, so different from anything Josephine had expected to hear, that she found herself momentarily speechless. 3 husbands had claimed to love her, to want to protect and cherish her, but each had ultimately sought to possess her, to reshape her into something that fit their vision of what a wife should be. The idea that this stranger, this man who had risked his fortune and possibly his life to save her from the gallows, expected nothing in return seemed almost too good to be true. "You are either the most foolish man I have ever met," she said softly, "or the most generous. I cannot decide which." There was something in her voice that might have been the beginning of laughter, the first hint of lightness she had felt in months. $200 is a great deal of money to spend on someone else's freedom, especially when that someone might indeed be everything the good people of Deadwood believe her to be. Marcus turned slightly in the saddle, just enough to catch a glimpse of her face in the moonlight. "Mrs. Fairfax," he said, with something that definitely was the beginning of a smile, "I have been alone in these mountains for 10 years. During that time, I have had extensive conversations with squirrels, philosophical debates with ravens, and even a few heated arguments with a particularly opinionated porcupine. If you turn out to be a witch, you will still be considerably better company than anything I have enjoyed recently." The sound that escaped Josephine's lips was definitely laughter, rusty and uncertain but unmistakably real. It had been so long since she had found anything amusing that she had almost forgotten what her own laughter sounded like. The realization that she could still feel something as simple as humor after everything she had endured came as a shock, like discovering a flower blooming in the ashes of a burned forest. The trail began to climb more steeply as they entered the heart of the Black Hills, winding through stands of ponderosa pine and aspen that creaked and whispered in the wind like old women sharing secrets. The snow was falling more heavily now, thick flakes that clung to everything they touched and began to muffle the sounds of their passage. Marcus could feel Josephine shivering behind him, her thin dress offering little protection against the mountain cold, and he began to worry about how much farther they could travel before hypothermia became a real danger. "There is a way station about 2 miles ahead," he said, raising his voice slightly to be heard over the wind. "It is nothing fancy, just a cabin that trappers use when the weather turns bad, but it will be warm and dry. We can rest there until the storm passes, get you some proper clothes, and a hot meal." He felt her arms tighten around his waist as the horse picked its way carefully along a section of trail where ice had made the footing treacherous. The way station, when they finally reached it, proved to be a squat log structure built into the side of a granite cliff, positioned to take advantage of the natural windbreak provided by the rock face. Someone, probably Marcus himself on a previous trip, had stocked it with firewood and basic supplies, understanding that in country like this, the difference between preparedness and death was often measured in degrees rather than miles. The door was secured with a simple rope latch, the universal signal among mountain men that the cabin was available to anyone who needed shelter. Marcus dismounted first, then helped Josephine down from the horse with hands that were careful not to linger or presume. She stood unsteadily for a moment, her legs trembling from the long ride in the cold, her face pale in the moonlight, except for the spots of red that marked where the wind had burned her cheeks. Without a word, he wrapped his heavy coat around her shoulders, ignoring her weak protest that he would freeze without it. "I have been cold before, Mrs. Fairfax," he said as he pushed open the cabin door and ushered her inside. "Believe me when I say that I am considerably more accustomed to it than you are." The interior of the way station was Spartan but functional, containing a stone fireplace, a rough wooden table, 2 chairs, and a single bunk built against the far wall. Shelves held tin cans of beans and preserved meat, bags of flour and coffee, and other staples that could mean the difference between life and death for a stranded traveler. While Marcus built up the fire and set coffee to boil, Josephine explored the small space with the careful curiosity of someone who had learned to assess her surroundings for potential dangers. The cabin was clean and well-maintained despite its rough construction, and everywhere she looked, she saw evidence of the kind of thoughtful preparation that spoke to a man who understood the unforgiving nature of mountain winters. Extra blankets were stored in a wooden chest, kerosene lamps stood ready to be lit, and even a small collection of books wrapped in oiled cloth suggested that whoever maintained this place understood that men needed food for their minds as well. "As their bodies, you built this place?" she asked, running her fingers along the carefully chinked logs that formed the walls. The workmanship was excellent, the kind of solid construction that would last for decades if properly maintained. Every detail spoke to someone who took pride in his work, who understood that in the wilderness, shoddy craftsmanship could literally be a matter of life and death. Not built, exactly, Marcus replied as he stirred the fire and watched the flames begin to catch. I found it about 5 years ago, half collapsed and full of pack rat nests. Took me the better part of a summer to make it habitable again, but it seemed like something that should be preserved. These mountains can kill a man quickly if he does not have proper shelter when the weather turns ugly. He glanced at her over his shoulder, noting how the firelight was beginning to bring some color back to her pale cheeks as the cabin warmed, and the coffee began to fill the air with its rich aroma. Josephine felt some of the tension begin to leave her shoulders for the first time in weeks. The simple act of being warm and dry, of sitting by a fire without armed guards watching her every move, was such a luxury that she found herself blinking back tears of pure relief. She had grown so accustomed to expecting the worst from every situation that the basic human kindness Marcus showed her seemed almost miraculous. "Tell me about your husbands," Marcus said suddenly, his voice gentle but direct as he poured coffee into 2 tin cups and offered her one. Not the stories that Ashford was telling, but the truth. What really happened to them? He settled into the chair across from her, his dark eyes serious but without judgment. "You do not have to answer if you do not want to, but it seems to me that a woman does not acquire a reputation like yours without there being more to the story than most people bother to learn." Josephine wrapped her hands around the warm cup, using its heat to chase the last of the cold from her fingers, while she considered how much truth she was willing to share with this stranger who had risked so much to save her. The full story was long and complicated, full of details that would sound like excuses or lies to most ears. But something in Marcus's expression, in the patient way he waited for her to decide what she wanted to say, made her think that he might actually listen rather than simply judge. "Thomas was my first husband," she began slowly, her voice barely above a whisper. "I was 17 when I married him, an orphan who knew nothing about love or marriage or what it meant to be a wife. He was 43, a widower with a farm outside Yankton, and everyone said I was lucky that such a respectable man would take a chance on a girl with no family and no dowry." She paused to sip her coffee, using the bitter warmth to give herself courage to continue. "He was not a cruel man, not exactly, but he was not a kind one either. He married me because he needed someone to cook and clean and help with the harvest, not because he loved me or wanted to make me happy. For 3 months, I tried to be the wife he wanted, tried to learn his ways and please him in all things. But Thomas had a weak heart, though he refused to admit it, and the strain of working his fields in the Dakota heat was more than his body could handle." Her green eyes grew distant as she remembered those final terrible moments. The morning he died, we had argued about something trivial, whether to plant corn or wheat in the north field. He became angry, shouting and waving his arms, his face growing red as a beet. And then he simply collapsed, clutching his chest, his eyes wide with surprise and pain. I tried to help him, ran for the doctor, but it was too late. He was dead before the sun reached its peak, and by evening the neighbors were whispering that I had somehow caused it. Marcus listened without interruption, his expression thoughtful rather than skeptical. He had seen enough of frontier life to know that death came quickly and often without warning, especially to men who pushed themselves beyond their physical limits. The idea that a 17-year-old girl could somehow cause a heart attack through supernatural means seemed considerably less likely than the possibility that a middle-aged farmer had simply worked himself to death. The second husband was Jonathan Miller, Josephine continued, her voice growing stronger as she found that Marcus's calm attention made it easier to tell her story. "I married him a year later, partly because I needed the security and partly because his children needed a mother. He was different from Thomas, gentler and more considerate, and for a while I thought I might actually be happy with him. But Jonathan had a cough that he could not shake, a deep rattling sound that kept him awake at night and grew worse as the months passed." She paused again, her hands tightening around the coffee cup as she remembered the sound of that cough. The way it had gradually consumed more and more of Jonathan's strength, until he was too weak to work or eat or even speak above a whisper. The doctor said it was consumption, that he had probably been carrying the disease in his lungs for years, before it finally took hold. But the townspeople saw only that another of my husbands had died, and the whispers grew louder. They said I was cursed, that any man who loved me was doomed to an early grave. And the third? Marcus asked gently when she fell silent, her eyes fixed on the flames dancing in the fireplace. He could see the pain in her expression, the weight of guilt and grief that she carried despite the fact that neither death sounded like anything she could have prevented or caused. Captain Henry Dalton, she said with a bitter laugh that held no humor at all. I married him because I thought a soldier would be strong enough to survive whatever curse people believed I carried. He was handsome and brave and utterly convinced that love could conquer any obstacle, including supernatural ones. For 6 months, I actually believed him. For 6 months, I thought I had finally found a man who could love me without paying the price that seemed to follow in my wake. The fire crackled in the silence that followed, sending sparks up the chimney and casting dancing shadows on the cabin walls. Outside, the wind had picked up even more, driving the snow against the windows with a sound like thrown sand. Marcus could see that finishing her story was costing Josephine considerable effort, but he sensed that she needed to tell it, needed to share the burden of truth with someone who would listen without immediately condemning her. Henry died on a routine patrol, thrown from his horse when the animal stepped in a prairie dog hole and broke its leg, she said finally, her voice flat with the kind of exhaustion that came from carrying too much sorrow for too long. It was the sort of accident that could happen to anyone, the kind of random tragedy that soldiers face every day. But by then, my reputation had spread throughout the territory. People said I had cursed him, that I had used witchcraft to call down misfortune on yet another husband who had been foolish enough to love me. And you began to believe them, Marcus said quietly, his dark eyes full of understanding rather than pity. After 3 husbands, 3 accidents, 3 coincidences that people refused to see as anything other than supernatural malevolence, you started to wonder if maybe they were right. Maybe you really were cursed. Maybe anyone who loved you was doomed to die. Josephine looked up at him sharply, surprised by his insight into the thoughts she had never voiced aloud. How did you know? She asked, her voice barely above a whisper. How could you possibly understand what it feels like to watch everyone you care about die while you remain untouched, unharmed, alone? Tears had begun to gather in her green eyes, the first she had allowed herself to shed in months. Marcus was quiet for a long moment, staring into the fire as if seeking answers in the dancing flames. When he finally spoke, his voice carried the weight of his own losses, his own years of wondering if he was somehow responsible for tragedies beyond his control. Because I have been there, Mrs. Fairfax. Because I know what it is like to survive when others do not. To carry the guilt of being the one who lived when perhaps you should have been the one who died. He stood and walked to the small window, gazing out at the storm that was rapidly burying the mountain world in white. 10 years ago, I was married to a woman named Sarah Running Bear, daughter of a Lakota chief who had agreed to an arranged marriage to cement an alliance between his people and the white traders. It was supposed to be a marriage of convenience, a political arrangement that would benefit both sides. But something remarkable happened. We fell in love, truly and deeply, in a way that surprised both of us. Josephine found herself leaning forward, drawn into his story despite her own grief. There was something in his voice, a careful control that spoke of deep pain held in check, that made her understand that he was sharing something precious and private, something that he had perhaps never told another living soul. For 2 years, we were happy in a way that I had never imagined possible. Sarah taught me her people's ways, their language and customs and spiritual beliefs. I learned to see the world through Lakota eyes, to understand the sacred nature of the land and the animals that lived upon it. We had a son, a beautiful boy named Little Wolf, who had his mother's dark eyes and her gentle spirit. Marcus's voice began to grow thick with emotion, but he continued speaking, as if the words had been trapped inside him for too long. The cavalry came in the winter of 1861, soldiers who had been drinking and looking for trouble. They claimed that some horses had been stolen from a nearby settlement, though no one could prove that any of Sarah's people had been involved. The commanding officer was a man named Colonel Morrison, the same Morrison whose son tried to bid on you tonight. He had decided that the best way to prevent future thefts was to make an example of the Indians who lived too close to white settlements. The fire in the fireplace seemed to dim as Marcus continued his story, as if the flames themselves were affected by the darkness of the memories he was sharing. Josephine could see his hands trembling slightly where they rested on the windowsill, could hear the carefully controlled pain in his voice as he forced himself to relive the worst night of his life. I was away when they came, checking trap lines in the high country, planning to be gone for only 2 days. When I returned, I found the village burned, the people scattered or dead, my wife and son among the bodies that lay frozen in the snow. Sarah had been shot trying to protect Little Wolf, who had been trampled by cavalry horses as he tried to run to safety. His voice broke completely on the last words, and he stood with his back to her, his shoulders shaking with the force of emotions too long suppressed. Josephine rose from her chair without conscious thought, drawn by an impulse to comfort that was stronger than her own pain. She moved to stand beside him at the window, close enough to feel the heat radiating from his body, but careful not to touch him without permission. "I am so sorry," she whispered, her voice thick with tears for his loss as well as her own. "That is a grief too terrible for any man to bear alone. For years, I blamed myself." Marcus continued, his voice steadier now but still heavy with old sorrow. "If I had been there, if I had not gone to check those damned trap lines, maybe I could have protected them. Maybe I could have warned the village in time, helped them escape or hide until the danger passed. The guilt nearly drove me mad. I spent months tracking down every soldier who had been part of that raid, and I killed them, one by one, until only Morrison himself remained." He turned to face her then, his dark eyes reflecting the firelight like black mirrors. "But when I finally found him, when I had my rifle aimed at his heart and my finger on the trigger, I realized that killing him would not bring back my family. It would only make me the same kind of monster that he was, the same kind of man who could take innocent lives to satisfy his own twisted sense of justice. So I let him live, and I came to these mountains to be alone with my ghosts." The silence that followed was profound, broken only by the storm raging outside and the soft crackle of the fire. Two people who had lost everything that mattered to them stood facing each other in a small cabin buried in the heart of the Black Hills, each recognizing in the other a kindred spirit who understood the weight of survivor's guilt and the terrible loneliness that came with being the one left behind. "We are a pair, are we not?" Josephine said finally, her voice soft but steady. "Two people who have been blamed for tragedies beyond our control. Two souls who have learned to expect the worst because that is what life has taught us to expect." She managed a small, sad smile. "Perhaps that is why you were willing to bid on a cursed woman tonight. Perhaps you understand that sometimes the only way to heal from one kind of damage is to help someone else heal from another." Marcus studied her face in the firelight, seeing past the bruises and the exhaustion to the strength and intelligence that had helped her survive 3 marriages, 3 funerals, and months of imprisonment. She was beautiful. There was no denying that, but her beauty was only part of what drew him to her. There was something else, something in her eyes that spoke to the part of his soul that had been dead for 10 years. "Perhaps," he said quietly, reaching out to gently touch her hand where it rested on the windowsill. "Or perhaps we are both simply tired of being alone with our ghosts." Her skin was soft and warm beneath his fingers, and he felt something stir in his chest that he had thought buried forever with Sarah and little Wolf. The storm continued to rage outside, but inside the way station, two broken souls had found something that neither had dared to hope for. Not love, not yet, but the possibility of healing. The chance that maybe the worst parts of their lives were behind them rather than ahead. And as they stood together by the window, watching the snow fall like a blessing on the mountain world beyond, both of them felt something that they had almost forgotten existed. Hope. 3 weeks had passed since the storm at the way station.
Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us now. Back to the story.
And Marcus's cabin in the high country had become something neither of them had expected. What should have been temporary shelter had transformed into something that felt dangerously close to home. A place where two wounded souls were learning to exist without constantly expecting disaster to strike. The cabin was built with careful craftsmanship, 2 rooms connected by a stone archway, with a main living area dominated by a fieldstone fireplace and a smaller back room that Marcus had converted into sleeping quarters for Josephine. Windows faced east and south to catch morning light, and the structure was positioned near a natural hot spring that provided warmth and fresh water throughout brutal mountain winters. Marcus had proven to be a man of unexpected depths during their time together. He could read and write in 3 languages, having learned French from voyageurs and Lakota from his wife's people. His small collection of books included everything from Shakespeare to scientific treatises. In the evenings, he would read aloud while Josephine mended his clothes or prepared their simple meals, his deep voice bringing stories to life in the flickering lamplight. During daylight hours, Josephine truly began to understand the man who had rescued her. Marcus moved through the wilderness with fluid grace that spoke of decades learning to read the subtle signs that meant the difference between survival and death. He could track deer through unmarked snow, predict weather changes hours before they arrived, find food and shelter in places that looked utterly barren. More importantly, he treated her with respectful kindness that was entirely new in her experience. He never pressured her for intimacy, never suggested that the money he had paid entitled him to anything more than her company. Instead, he seemed content to simply exist in her presence, to share meals and conversations and comfortable silences. It was the first time in her adult life that Josephine had lived with a man who did not seem to want anything from her except the chance to know who she really was. This morning, however, something was different. Marcus had been restless since before dawn, moving around the cabin with controlled tension that spoke of a man sensing danger, but unable to identify its source. He checked and rechecked his weapons, tested wind direction repeatedly, and kept glancing toward the windows as if expecting to see something that should not be there. "We have been watched for the past 3 days," he said quietly, his dark eyes serious as he scanned the tree line visible through the south window. "Someone has been moving through the timber about a mile below us, trying to stay hidden but not quite skilled enough to avoid leaving sign. Yesterday I found the remains of a cold camp, and this morning I discovered fresh horse tracks near the creek that do not belong to any animal I have seen in these parts." Josephine felt a chill settling in her stomach as she processed what he was telling her. She had hoped that leaving Deadwood behind would mean leaving its prejudices and fears behind as well. But apparently some people were not content to let her simply disappear into the wilderness. "Do you think they mean us harm?" she asked, though something in his expression had already given her the answer. Men do not spend 3 days tracking someone through country this difficult unless they have serious business to conduct, Marcus replied grimly. "The question is whether they are looking for you specifically, or whether they simply do not like the idea of a white woman living with a half-breed in their precious Black Hills." His hand moved unconsciously to rest on the grip of his rifle. Before Josephine could respond, the sound of approaching horses echoed through the thin mountain air, the steady clip-clop of hooves on rocky ground growing louder with each passing moment. Marcus was moving before the sound fully registered, his rifle in his hands and his body positioned to cover the approach to the cabin door. "Get into the back room," he said quietly but firmly. "Take the shotgun from beside the bed and stay down until I tell you it is safe." But Josephine had spent too many months as a prisoner to willingly hide when trouble came calling. Instead, she moved to the window beside the fireplace, positioning herself where she could see the approaching riders while remaining partially concealed behind heavy wooden shutters. "I will not cower while you face whatever is coming," she said, with determination that surprised them both. "If these men have come here because of me, then I have a right to face them." The first rider to emerge from the tree line was immediately recognizable despite the weeks that had passed since the auction in Deadwood. Judge Cornelius Ashford sat his horse with rigid posture of a man who considered himself the embodiment of divine justice, his black coat immaculate despite the long ride through difficult terrain. Behind him rode 4 other men, their faces hard with the kind of righteous anger that came from believing they were doing God's work. Marcus recognized 2 of the other riders as men who had been present at the auction, miners whose claims had failed and who now blamed their misfortune on everything except their own poor judgment. The third was a stranger, but his collar marked him as another preacher, probably brought along to provide additional spiritual authority. The 4th man, however, made Marcus's blood run cold with recognition and old fury. Colonel Jake Morrison sat his horse with military bearing despite being 20 years past his prime. His uniform was faded and patched, his gray beard streaked with tobacco stains, but his pale eyes still held the same cold cruelty that had driven him to massacre a peaceful Lakota village 10 years earlier. The sight of the man who had destroyed his family standing outside his cabin filled Marcus with rage so pure and white-hot that for a moment he could hardly breathe. "Marcus Blackstone!" Ashford's voice carried clearly across the clearing, sharp with authority and cold with condemnation. "By the power vested in me by the territorial government, I order you to surrender the woman known as Josephine Fairfax for transport to the territorial capital, where she will face proper judgment for her crimes against God and nature." Marcus stepped onto the cabin's covered porch, his rifle held ready but not yet pointed at the assembled men. "Judge Ashford," he replied calmly, though his voice carried undertones that any experienced frontiersman would recognize as dangerous. "I was not aware that you had jurisdiction this far into the mountains, nor that purchasing a woman's freedom at a legal auction had become a crime punishable by armed expedition. Do not play word games with me, half-breed," Ashford snarled, his composure slipping to reveal ugly prejudice beneath his veneer of legal authority. "That woman is a menace to every God-fearing soul in this territory, and your contaminated blood makes you unfit to make decisions about her fate. Stand aside and let us take her, or face the consequences of harboring a known witch." "Mrs. Fairfax is under my protection," Marcus said quietly, his voice carrying the kind of calm certainty that made experienced fighters nervous. "She has committed no crime except having the misfortune to outlive 3 husbands who died of natural causes. If you wish to discuss this matter further, you are welcome to dismount and come inside for coffee. But if you have come here with thoughts of taking her against her will, then you should know that I am prepared to defend her life with my own." Colonel Morrison urged his horse forward a few steps, his hand resting on the butt of his service revolver. "Still protecting Indians and their sympathizers, I see," he said with a cruel smile that did not reach his eyes. "You should have learned your lesson 10 years ago when your squaw wife and her mongrel child learned what happens to savages who think they can live among civilized people." The words hit Marcus like physical blows, each syllable designed to reopen wounds that had never properly healed. For a moment, the world seemed to narrow to a red tunnel with Morrison's sneering face at the end, and every instinct he possessed screamed at him to put a bullet between the colonel's eyes. But then he heard Josephine's sharp intake of breath from inside the cabin, and the sound reminded him that he was no longer alone with his ghosts. "Colonel Morrison," he said with deadly quiet, his rifle now pointed directly at the older man's chest. "You have exactly 10 seconds to apologize for speaking of my wife and son in such terms, or I will demonstrate why the Lakota called me, 'He who walks with thunder.'" The other men began reaching for their weapons. But Marcus's attention never wavered from Morrison's face. As if summoned by his words, Josephine appeared in the doorway beside him, the twin barrels of Marcus's shotgun steady in her hands despite the way her heart was pounding. She had heard Morrison's cruel words about Marcus's family, had seen the pain they caused flicker across his face, and something inside her had snapped. For months she had been the victim, the hunted, the one who needed protection. But now, standing beside this man who had risked everything to save her, she felt something she had never experienced before. "Gentlemen," she said in a voice that carried across the clearing like the crack of a whip, "you have ridden a very long way to threaten two people who have done you no harm. Colonel Morrison, your reputation precedes you, and not in ways that reflect well on your character. Judge Ashford, your understanding of territorial law appears to be as limited as your understanding of basic human decency." The standoff stretched on for what felt like hours but was probably only minutes. 5 mounted men facing 2 people on foot, all of them armed and ready for violence. The mountain air was so still that even the wind seemed to be holding its breath, waiting to see whether words or bullets would carry the day. Then, from the tree line behind the mounted men, came a sound that changed everything. The distinctive whistle of a Lakota war party echoed off the surrounding peaks, followed by the appearance of a dozen mounted warriors who emerged from concealment with fluid grace. They arranged themselves in a semicircle behind Ashford's group, effectively cutting off any chance of retreat. Marcus felt a smile tug at the corners of his mouth as he recognized the lead warrior, a man about his own age whose face bore distinctive scars that marked him as a member of the Oglala band. "Standing Bear," he called out in fluent Lakota, his voice carrying warmth that had been absent when he spoke to the white men. "It has been too long since we shared a fire and traded stories." "Indeed, my brother," Standing Bear replied in accented but clear English, his dark eyes never leaving the faces of the mounted white men, who now found themselves surrounded and outnumbered. "When my scouts reported that armed men were threatening the lodge of He Who Walks with Thunder, I felt compelled to investigate." Standing Bear's expression grew stern as he studied the faces of Ashford and his companions. "The spirits have spoken to our medicine man about this woman," he said in a voice that carried authority. "They say that she carries great sorrow but no evil, that the deaths that follow her are the result of a broken heart calling to other broken hearts, not the work of dark magic." Judge Ashford's face had gone white with fear at finding himself surrounded by armed Indians, but his prejudice was stronger than his survival instincts. "Savage lies," he shouted, his voice cracking with panic. "You cannot believe the word of heathens over Christian witnesses." Before the words were fully out of his mouth, Standing Bear was moving, his war pony dancing sideways to bring him within arm's reach of the judge's mount. With movement so fast it seemed like magic, the warrior's knife appeared in his hand, its blade resting against Ashford's throat. "Choose your next words very carefully, talking chief," Standing Bear said softly. "The woman you seek to harm is under the protection of my brother, and my brother is under the protection of the Oglala. If you wish to leave these mountains with your scalp still attached, you will turn your horses around and ride back to whatever hole you crawled out of." One by one, the mounted men turned their horses toward the trail that led down from the high country, their faces sullen with defeat. Colonel Morrison was the last to leave, his pale eyes promising future violence before he spurred his horse after the others. But as the sound of their departure faded, Marcus knew that this confrontation had solved nothing. Men like Ashford and Morrison did not give up easily, and they would not forgive the humiliation they had just suffered. "Will they really stay away?" Josephine asked, lowering the shotgun with hands that trembled slightly from adrenaline. "Or will they simply go back and gather more men, more weapons, more determination to see me hang. They will be back, Marcus said honestly, seeing no point in offering false comfort. Men like that do not accept defeat gracefully. The question is what we do about it when they return. Standing Bear, who had been conferring quietly with his warriors, rode closer to the cabin porch. There's another problem, my brother, he said grimly. My scouts report that government surveyors have been working the northern valleys, marking boundaries for what they claim will be a new mining district. And there are men with them who fight like soldiers but wear no uniforms. Marcus felt a chill of premonition as he processed what Standing Bear was telling him. Government surveyors meant that someone with political connections was planning to stake claims in this part of the Black Hills, and unofficial soldiers suggested that powerful people were willing to use violence to clear the area of inconvenient obstacles. How many surveyors? He asked grimly. 6 when they arrived. Standing Bear replied with matter-of-fact tone. But my warriors found their camp abandoned this morning, with signs of violence and no bodies. Someone wanted them gone, and they were willing to kill to make it happen. The implications hit both Marcus and Josephine simultaneously. This was not just about superstition or prejudice anymore. This was about money and power and the kind of people who were willing to eliminate anyone who stood in their way. And somehow, their simple desire to be left alone had put them directly in the path of forces much larger and more dangerous than Judge Ashford's provincial hatred. As the afternoon shadows began to lengthen across the mountain clearing, 3 people stood facing an uncertain future with the knowledge that their enemies were multiplying, and their safe haven was about to become a battlefield. The attack came at dawn 3 days later, not from the direction they had expected, but from the high ridges where professional killers had spent the night positioning themselves like pieces on a chessboard. Marcus woke to the distinctive crack of a Sharp's rifle echoing off the granite walls that surrounded his cabin, followed immediately by the wet thud of a bullet striking flesh, and Standing Bear's war cry of pain and fury from somewhere in the timber below. Josephine was already moving before Marcus fully processed what was happening. Her months of living under constant threat having honed her survival instincts to a razor's edge. She rolled out of her narrow bunk and onto the floor, staying low as she crawled toward the main room where Marcus kept the ammunition and spare weapons. Through the small window beside her bed, she could see muzzle flashes winking like deadly stars from at least 4 different positions on the surrounding slopes. How many? Marcus called softly as he checked the loads in his rifle and reached for the bandolier of cartridges that hung beside the fireplace. His voice was calm despite the circumstances, carrying the steady tone of a man who had faced death often enough to know that panic was more dangerous than bullets. Outside, the sounds of battle were growing louder as Standing Bear's warriors engaged their attackers with the fluid tactics that had made the Lakota feared throughout the northern plains. At least a dozen, Josephine replied, having counted. Muzzle flashes from her position near the window. Maybe more. They have us surrounded, but they seem more interested in keeping us pinned down than in making a direct assault on the cabin. She paused, listening to the rhythm of gunfire with the analytical attention of someone who had learned to read violence like other people read weather patterns. This is not the work of Ashford and his amateur vigilantes. These men know what they are doing. Marcus nodded grimly as he peered through a gap in the wooden shutters that covered the south-facing window. The attackers were indeed professionals, probably hired gunmen brought in by whoever was behind the surveyor operation that Standing Bear had mentioned. They had positioned themselves to control all the approaches to the cabin while maintaining fields of fire that would make any attempt to escape suicidal. More importantly, they were disciplined enough to coordinate their attack rather than simply charging in with guns blazing. A new sound cut through the gunfire, the distinctive whistle that Lakota warriors used to communicate across long distances. During battle, Standing Bear was calling for a fighting retreat toward the cabin, probably recognizing that his small band of warriors could not hope to dislodge well-positioned riflemen from fortified positions. Marcus could hear the sound of horses moving through the timber, accompanied by the war cries and taunts that warriors used to keep their enemies off balance during running fights. "They are falling back to the cabin," Marcus told Josephine, as he moved to the window that faced the trail where Standing Bear and his men would emerge from the forest. "When they break cover, we need to provide covering fire to help them reach the porch. Can you handle the shotgun at close range if any of these bastards try to rush us while I am focused on the long shots?" Josephine checked the loads in the Waya, double-barreled weapon with movements that were becoming automatic through repetition and necessity. "I can handle whatever comes through that door," she said with quiet determination. "Just make sure that Standing Bear and his men make it to safety. Without them, we will not last long enough to see another sunset, the first of Standing Bears." Warriors burst from the tree line at a full gallop, bent low over his horse's neck to present the smallest possible target to the riflemen on the ridges. Marcus could see blood on the man's left arm and a feathered arrow protruding from his horse's flank, but both rider and mount were still moving with the fluid grace that marked them as survivors of many battles. The warrior's rifle spoke twice as he rode. The bullets aimed not at specific targets, but at muzzle flashes that marked enemy positions. Marcus opened fire from the cabin window, his first shot taking one of the hidden riflemen in the shoulder and spinning him away from his position behind a granite boulder. His second shot missed its mark, but came close enough to force another attacker to duck for cover, disrupting the coordinated fire that was making the clearing in front of the cabin a killing field. Beside him, Josephine had taken position at the east window, her shotgun ready for any enemy foolish enough to try a direct assault. Standing Bear himself was the last to emerge from the forest, his war paint streaked with sweat and powder. Smoke, his rifle empty, but his war club bloody from close quarters fighting. His horse had been hit multiple times, but was still running on courage and adrenaline, carrying its rider toward the cabin with the desperate loyalty that existed only between warriors and their mounts. Marcus could see that Standing Bear was wounded, his right leg dark with blood, but the Lakota leader was still directing his men's retreat with hand signals and war cries. The moment Standing Bear's horse reached the cabin porch, everything changed. The disciplined gunfire from the ridges suddenly intensified, no longer aimed at keeping the defenders pinned down, but focused on preventing anyone from escaping the cabin alive. Bullets struck the log walls with sounds like giant hammers, sending splinters flying and making the whole structure shake with the impact. One shot shattered the glass in the south window, showering Marcus with fragments that cut his cheek and made him curse in languages that Josephine had never heard before. "This is not a siege," Standing Bear said grimly as he slumped against the cabin wall, his wound bleeding freely despite the makeshift bandage one of his warriors had applied. "This is an execution. They mean to kill all of us and burn the cabin to hide the evidence. Someone very powerful wants this mountain cleared of witnesses, and they are willing to commit murder to make it happen, through the broken window." Marcus could see movement on the ridges as the attackers began to shift their positions for what looked like a final assault. They had the defenders outnumbered and outgunned, and time was on their side since help was unlikely to arrive in this remote part of the Black Hills. But Marcus had not survived 10 years in the wilderness by accepting defeat easily, and his mind was already working on the kind of desperate gamble that might give them a chance. "The hot spring," he said suddenly, his dark eyes lighting up with the kind of inspiration that came from intimate knowledge of the local terrain. "There is a cave system behind the spring that connects to the old mine workings on the north face. If we can reach it without being seen, we might be able to get behind their lines and even the odds a little." Standing Bear's expression grew thoughtful despite the pain from his wound. "How many men can the cave passage hold?" he asked already, understanding what Marcus was proposing. "And how long would it take to reach the mine entrance?" His warriors were listening intently, their faces showing the kind of desperate hope that came from realizing that suicide might not be their only option. 3 men could move through it quickly, Marcus replied, already reaching for the supplies they would need for such a mission. Maybe 4 if they did not mind getting very wet and very cold. The passage is partly flooded, and there are places where you have to crawl through spaces barely wide enough for a man's shoulders. But it would put us behind the main group of riflemen, and if we could take out their leaders, the rest might lose their stomach for this fight. Josephine looked up sharply from her position by the window, her green eyes flashing with something. That might have been anger or might have been determination. If you think I am staying here while you 3 go off to play hero, you are sadly mistaken, she said with a tone that brooked no argument. I have been running from killers for months, and I am tired of being the helpless victim that everyone else has to protect. Besides, you will need someone to watch your backs while you are focused on the men in front of you. Before Marcus could object, another volley of rifle fire struck the cabin, this time accompanied by the smell of smoke and the orange flicker of flames visible through the gaps in the shutters. The attackers had decided to burn them out, probably using fire arrows or oil-soaked rags to set the roof ablaze. Within minutes, the cabin would become a death trap, forcing them to choose between burning alive or running into the guns that waited outside. The spring, Marcus said curtly, all debate about who would go and who would stay rendered meaningless by the approaching flames. Everyone, now, before the smoke gets too thick to see. He grabbed his rifle and a bag of ammunition, while Standing Bear's warriors gathered their weapons and what little gear they could carry. The wounded Lakota leader protested that he would slow them down, but his men simply lifted him bodily and carried him toward the back of the cabin, where a small door led to the hot spring. The cave entrance was hidden behind a curtain of mineral-stained rock that the spring had deposited over thousands of years, invisible unless you knew exactly where to look. Marcus had discovered it during his first winter in the cabin, when a blizzard had trapped him for days and boredom had driven him to explore every inch of his surroundings. The passage beyond was narrow and treacherous, carved by underground water that still flowed through parts of the system, but it connected to workings that miners had abandoned when the easily accessible ore played out. Josephine gasped as prone. The icy water of the underground stream hit her legs, the shock of cold so intense that it drove the breath from her lungs and made her muscles cramp. But she forced herself to keep moving, following Marcus's dark form through passages that seemed designed to test every fear of confined spaces that human beings possessed. Behind her, she could hear Standing Bear's warriors struggling with their wounded leader, their progress marked by muffled curses in Lakota and the splash of bodies moving through water that felt like liquid ice. The passage seemed to go on forever, winding through solid rock in directions that made no sense to anyone who was not intimately familiar with the geological forces that had shaped the Black Hills over millions of years. Sometimes they crawled through spaces so narrow that Josephine's shoulders scraped against stone on both sides, and sometimes they waded through pools where the water reached their chests and the current threatened to sweep them into side passages from which they might never emerge. When they finally saw daylight filtering down from somewhere ahead, Josephine had lost all sense of time and direction. Her entire world had narrowed to the need to keep moving, to follow Marcus's steady progress through a maze that would have defeated anyone less familiar with its secrets. Her clothes were soaked through and her hands were cut from scrambling over sharp rocks, but she was alive and free and ready to fight back against the people who had tried to burn her alive. The mine entrance was concealed by a rockfall that looked natural, but had actually been arranged by previous occupants to hide their activities from unwanted visitors. Marcus moved the stones with practiced efficiency, revealing an opening just large enough for a person to squeeze through. Beyond lay a tunnel that had been carved by men rather than water, its walls still bearing the marks of picks and shovels wielded by miners who had dreamed of striking it rich in the Black Hills. The main shaft comes out about 50 yards. Behind the largest group of riflemen, Marcus whispered as they gathered in the tunnel to plan their next move. If we can reach it without being detected, we should be able to take them by surprise. But once the shooting starts, every gunman on this mountain will know where we are, and they will converge on our position like wolves on wounded prey, standing. Bear had managed the journey through the cave system despite his wounds, but Josephine could see that he was weakening from blood loss and the shock of prolonged immersion in ice-cold water. His face was gray beneath his war paint, and his hands shook slightly as he checked the loads in his rifle. But his eyes still burned with the fierce determination that had made him a war leader among his people. "My warriors and I will take the men on the eastern ridge," he said quietly, his voice barely above a whisper in the confines of the tunnel. "You and the woman concentrate on the group that has the best field of fire on the cabin. If we can break their coordinated fire, even for a few minutes, it might be enough to turn this fight in our direction." Josephine felt a strange calm settling over her as she listened to the men plan their assault on enemies who had tried to kill them all. For months, she had been passive, allowing others to decide her fate while she waited to see whether she would live or die. But now, crouched in a mine tunnel with a rifle in her hands and the taste of cordite in the air, she felt something that she had never experienced before. She felt dangerous. The attack began with Standing Bear's war cry echoing off the granite walls of the canyon, a sound that had struck fear into the hearts of cavalrymen and settlers for generations. His warriors emerged from concealment like avenging spirits, their rifles speaking with deadly accuracy as they caught the eastern group of gunmen completely off guard. 2 attackers fell in the first volley, and the rest scrambled for better cover while trying to understand how their victims had suddenly appeared behind them. Marcus and Josephine struck simultaneously at the main group of riflemen, their combined fire devastating in its precision and timing. Marcus's first shot took the apparent leader through the chest, dropping him behind the boulder he had been using for cover. Josephine's rifle barked twice in rapid succession, the heavy bullets finding their marks among men who were still trying to locate their new attackers. The coordinated fire that had pinned them in the cabin suddenly became ragged and uncertain as the hunters became the hunted. But the professional killers were not ordinary gunmen, and they adapted to the changed circumstances with the speed that came from years of violent experience. Within moments, they had identified the new threats and were returning fire with a discipline that spoke of military training and combat experience. Bullets sparked off the rocks around the mine entrance, forcing Marcus and Josephine to take cover deeper in the tunnel. "There are too many of them," Josephine said as she reloaded her rifle with fingers that moved automatically despite the chaos surrounding them. "Even with the element of surprise, we do not have enough firepower to break them completely. They will regroup and overwhelm us through sheer numbers." Marcus was about to agree when a new sound cut through the gunfire, the distinctive thunder of heavy cavalry approaching at full gallop. Through the smoke and dust of battle, he could see blue uniforms and guidons flying, a full troop of territorial cavalry riding hard toward the sound of guns. At their head rode a young officer whose face was grim with the kind of determination that came from finally having the chance to do something right. "Cease fire! Cease fire!" The cavalry officer shouted as his men dismounted and took positions that effectively surrounded the remaining gunmen. "This is Lieutenant William Custer of the 7th Cavalry, and you are all under arrest for murder and conspiracy." His voice carried the authority of federal law, backed Biffardy-mounted soldiers who had their weapons trained on anyone who looked like they might resist. The battle ended as suddenly as it had begun, the surviving attackers throwing down their weapons, rather than face the combined fire of cavalry carbines and the rifles of their intended victims. As the smoke began to clear and the echoes of gunfire faded into the mountain silence, Josephine found herself standing in the mouth of a mine tunnel, holding a smoking rifle and looking down at the bodies of men who had tried to kill her for the simple crime of wanting to be left alone. Standing Bear limped over to where Marcus and Josephine stood, his warriors flanking him with the satisfied expressions of men who had settled an old score. It appears that someone in the territorial government finally decided to investigate the reports of missing surveyors and unauthorized military operations, he said with grim satisfaction. These men will talk rather than hang, and when they do, we will finally learn who has been trying to turn our sacred mountains into a killing ground. Lieutenant Custer approached them with the careful respect due to people who had just survived a battle, his young face serious as he surveyed the scene of carnage that surrounded Marcus's burning cabin. "Mr. Blackstone, Mrs. Fairfax," he said formally, "I apologize for not arriving sooner. We have been tracking this group for weeks, but they stayed ahead of us until your fight forced them to make a stand." As the cavalry began the grim work of collecting bodies and securing prisoners, Josephine looked around at the destruction that had been wrought in the name of greed and prejudice. Her temporary home was gone, reduced to smoking ruins and scattered ashes. But somehow, standing beside Marcus with his rifle still warm in her hands, and the knowledge that she had fought back against those who would destroy her, she felt something that she had never experienced before. She felt free. 6 months later, spring had transformed the Black Hills into something that seemed almost magical after the violence and bloodshed of the previous autumn. Wild roses bloomed along the creek banks where Marcus and Josephine had built their new cabin, smaller than the old one but positioned to take advantage of both the hot spring and a spectacular view of the valley below. The structure itself was a collaboration between 3 cultures, combining Marcus's wilderness craftsmanship with Lakota building techniques and touches of refinement that reflected Josephine's Eastern upbringing. The trial in Deadwood had lasted 3 weeks and had revealed a conspiracy that reached all the way to Washington, involving territorial officials, mining interests, and military contractors who had planned to use manufactured Indian troubles as an excuse to seize the most valuable mineral rights in the Black Hills. Judge Ashford had been sentenced to 20 years in federal prison for his role in the scheme, while Colonel Morrison faced court-martial for exceeding his authority and participating in the murder of government surveyors who had refused to falsify their reports. More importantly for Josephine, the trial had finally put to rest the superstitions that had haunted her for years. Testimony from doctors, clergymen, and territorial officials had established beyond doubt that her 3 husbands had died of natural causes, their deaths no more supernatural than the countless other tragedies that marked frontier life. The myth of the cursed widow had been replaced by the reality of a woman who had simply had the misfortune to love men whose time had come too soon. Standing Bear's recovery had been slow but complete, and his friendship with Marcus had deepened into something that transcended the usual boundaries between white and Indian society. The Lakota leader had become a frequent visitor to their new cabin, bringing news from the reservation and sharing the kind of stories that helped bridge the gap between 2 very different ways of understanding the world. His presence had also served as protection against any lingering prejudice from the white settlements, since few men were foolish enough to threaten someone under Oglala protection. But the most significant change had been in the relationship between Marcus and Josephine themselves. The shared danger and the knowledge that they had faced death together had stripped away the last barriers of mistrust and uncertainty that had kept them from acknowledging what had been growing between them since that first night in the way station. They had been married by a traveling circuit judge in a ceremony that combined Christian vows with Lakota blessing rituals, creating a union that honored both their backgrounds. This morning, as Josephine worked in the garden she had planted beside the cabin, she felt the familiar flutter of life within her that spoke of the future taking root in the most literal sense. The child would be born in the autumn, when the aspen leaves turned gold and the first snows began to dust the higher peaks. Marcus had been overjoyed when she told him, his dark eyes bright with a happiness that she had never seen in them before, as if the prospect of new life had finally allowed him to let go of the ghosts that had haunted him for so long. The trading post in Bear Butte wants us to supply them with herbs and preserved foods for the winter, Marcus said as he emerged from the cabin with a letter that had arrived with the morning mail. They are offering good money, and it would give us a chance to build up our savings before the baby comes. His voice carried the quiet satisfaction of a man who had found his place in the world and was content with what he had built. Josephine straightened from her work among the medicinal plants that she had learned to cultivate under the guidance of Lakota, women who had become her friends and teachers. "I would like that," she said, brushing dirt from her hands and smiling at the man who had saved her life in ways that went far beyond the simple act of bidding at an auction. "It feels good to have people value what we can create rather than fear what they imagine we might destroy." As the sun reached its zenith and painted the valley in shades of green and gold that seemed too beautiful to be real, Marcus and Josephine stood together on the porch of their cabin, looking out over country that had tested them both and found them worthy of its harsh gifts. Behind them, smoke rose from the chimney where their dinner was cooking, and around them, the sounds of birds and wind and running water spoke of a world at peace with itself. In the distance, they could see riders approaching along the trail that connected their valley to the outside world, but these were not the armed men who had once brought death and destruction to their mountain sanctuary. Instead, they were neighbors coming to share a meal, and the kind of conversation that built communities from the scattered homesteads of people who had chosen to make their lives in difficult places. "Do you ever regret it?" Josephine asked, quietly, her hand resting on the slight swell of her belly where their child grew. "Giving up your solitude for a cursed woman and all the complications that came with her." There was no sadness in her voice, only curiosity about the thoughts of a man who had changed the entire course of his life for someone he had known for less than an hour. Marcus considered the question seriously, as he did most things, his dark eyes taking in the cabin they had built together, the garden that fed them, and the friends who were riding toward them with the easy confidence of people who knew they were welcome. "I gave up solitude," he said finally, his voice warm with something that sounded very much like contentment. "But I gained something much more valuable. I gained a life worth living." The riders were close enough now to identify, and Josephine could see that they included Standing Bear and several of his warriors, Lieutenant Custer and his new wife, and even the circuit judge who had married them, all coming together for the kind of celebration that marked the successful conclusion of a story that could easily have ended in tragedy. As she watched them approach, Josephine felt something that she had never expected to experience again. She felt blessed.
Up next, you've got 2 more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hit the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out, and don't forget to subscribe and turn on the notification bell so you don't miss any upload from us.